All right, welcome everyone to the UT Energy Symposium. Before I introduce the speaker, I'll announce the speaker for next week. Next week's going to be Mike Leggett, who has worked formerly at ERCOT, who's a former UT student, and has a varied background. He's now CEO and founder of Resilient Grid Incorporated, but he has degrees in clinical health psychology and neuropsychology, but he's working on human factors associated with operating the ERCOT grid. How do people effectively interact and systems, human-based systems, interact with physical world? So what's the difference between resilience in the physical world versus the people that interact with it? So it should be a pretty good talk on that. His title is going to be Building a Smart Grid Through Smart Decision Making and Smart Organization. So basically, we need smart people and smart stuff, and what's the trade-off there? So looking forward to that one. Today we have Eric Kemp-Benedict here from Stockholm Environment Institute. So Eric is not based in Stockholm in Sweden. That's where the headquarters of the organization is, but the US-based center is in Boston, which is registered as a US nonprofit, 501c3. So they are sort of linked, but also a US organization. He is a former Longhorn as well, so a BS in physics from the University of Texas, and he got a PhD in theoretical physics from Boston University. So he's going to give us an economics talk. So this is a purely, a physically science-trained person who's going to tell us about economics. So that's pretty much why I invited him here. I was like, I want some non-economists to talk about the economy to see what we think about those kind of viewpoints. With Stockholm Environment Institute, he has been part of the Rethinking Development campaign, and he was the director of the Asia Center for several years as well. So with that being said, we're going to let him get to his talk here to tell us about what kinds of coupling or decoupling the economy from energy or resources there can actually be. So with that said, see if we can start the presentation again, and take it away, Eric.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk about some new approaches to an old problem using some new refinements, building on some refinements to some old economics. And I'll just give a quick overview of the talk, which you can't see, but I'll say it. So the title of the talk is Decoupling Energy Consumption from GDP Under Biased Technological Change. And what I'm going to talk about is first, why do I want to talk about this issue of decoupling energy consumption from GDP? Then I'll show some trends. I'll talk about some of the extant theories, Jevons Paradox and the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis. I'll go on from that and talk then about the approach that I'm taking, biased technological change, and explain a bit about where that comes from. Then I'll take that theory and apply it to energy, and then discuss some policy implications. I will alert you, there is some math in here. It gets kind of intense. At one point, if that's not your thing, don't worry about it. It can help to follow along if you do have the mathematical background, but I'm going to make the points also in words and diagrams. So that's how it goes, and you might be able to see those diagrams. Another point I'll just make, since it's not yet up on the screen, I'm going to talk about. Hey, that's cool. Can we get it brighter? Yeah. All right. Bright console. All right. You can see that okay. All right. Terrific. So why talk about decoupling? So for myself and many of my colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute, one thing that's really motivating us is the 2030 agenda that was adopted by the UN member states. A key part of which is the Sustainable Development Goals, aiming out towards 2030 to make progress on all these topics. I highlighted 5 that have something to do with energy or resource flows and their use in the economy. It's a really fundamental part of this. One of the most important of those goals is about climate change and climate mitigation. And this is from the UNEP emissions gap report, and you can see that compared to a non-policy baseline, with our current policies, already we're bringing down emissions. And then these independent, nationally determined contributions bring them down even more. This is what countries are pledging to do under the UNFCCC. It brings it down even more, and there's a couple of different varieties of those. The unconditional ones are what countries say they'll do by themselves. The conditional ones, what they say they'll do if other countries take action as well. And you can see that with those, it kind of flatlines out by 2025. You really bend it down and then flatline. That's great. That's actually quite ambitious. That's a big effort. And yet it's nowhere near close to what we need to do to keep warming below the 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius targets that were agreed by the parties to the climate convention. So even more has to be done. This is an enormous challenge. It's a generational challenge. I find challenges exciting, although this one is particularly daunting. It's got some serious implications for fossil reserves, and several authors have pointed this out. This is one particular set of authors. If you want to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, then most remaining fossil reserves have to stay in the ground. And just to give you a bit of perspective on where I'm coming from, I came here from Boston. I work for the Stockholm Environment Institute. I grew up in Houston. Both my parents and my uncle worked in the oil industry for many years. And I came to UT, so my tuition was subsidized by oil revenue. I understand this. But I studied physics, and I also understand the mechanisms that are driving anthropogenic climate change, and it's really hard to escape this. So this is the kind of challenge we're talking about. It's tremendous. And this next part, I just want to say a little bit about how I'm thinking about what the change can mean for us. These are things that many people in this room are going to be completely familiar with. I'm just putting it forward in my own thinking just to show you how I'm framing it. So fossil resources, they're finite in total, although as you saw, much larger than what we can afford just because of climate change. So the finitude isn't really the constraint at the moment. It's climate. But extraction can be varied over a wide range. Okay, so that's a basic fact about the fossil resources. And so stocks are ultimately limited, but flows, while those stocks last, are effectively unlimited. You can ramp them up. Renewable resources produce a flow, a stream of power, and those can be increased up to a point, but within constraints. And those constraints are soft. It's not a hard constraint. You can increase the rate at which you're diverting those flows, ultimately derived from the sun, but still, it's kind of constrained. So stocks are effectively unlimited. I mean, the concept of a stock, it's not a stock of energy. It's a stock of material that captures sunlight and produces useful energy. They're effectively unlimited, but the flows, the power that you can extract from them is limited. And so basically those two constraints have swapped. And so in a sustainability transition, in the very long run, we have to rely on renewables. The standing joke about fusion is it's the energy of the future and always will be, but every decade they make further strides. I mean, I'm always excited to read about what they're doing in fusion energy. The thing is, it's a very slow process, and it's not clear when it's going to come through, and so we can't rely on it for this really short-term change that we have to make. We can't expand conventional nuclear power, but to replace our existing fossil supply with all conventional nuclear, that's also extremely daunting. It's got high capital and operating costs, and it's got high social costs. And after Fukushima, a lot of countries just took it off the energy agenda. They're not looking at that. And so the way I'm looking at this is we have to transition from a stock-limited to a flow-limited, but technologically advanced economy. We have never done this in the past. We haven't seen this. We've had flow-limited agrarian economies. We've had ultimately stock-limited, but really with really weak constraints, technologically advanced economies. And now we need to figure out how to do this, how to make this transition. So this is the problem as I think about it, and I'm looking at this from an economic perspective, trying to understand how to analyze this. And what I'm going to show today is one strand of that work. There's various things I'm working on. But a key question here is about the prospects for decoupling. And decoupling, relative decoupling, energy consumption grows less quickly than GDP. That's all that you need for relative decoupling. Absolute is where you actually fully decouple. Energy consumption is unrelated to GDP. So you can still grow your economy even though you have some fundamental constraints on resources. So some trends, I pulled these from the book by Ayers and War, and you can see that from about 1915 onward, it's generally this exergy intensity. So exergy is basically useful energy. Exergy intensity per unit GDP has been going down because that's a negative slope. We do see at least relative decoupling. But total input, this is per capita, but you also see this trend for total, that's going up. So we have relative but not absolute decoupling. And the question is why? One idea that's been around since the 19th century was put forward by William Stanley Jevons that is now called Jevons Paradox. It is the very economy of coal's use which leads to its extensive consumption. That is, if you use it more efficiently, great, that drops the price. And so ways of using coal that had been unprofitable before now become profitable. So those start up. People's real incomes, they get more for their money. That rises. Their demand rises. And so what he was saying is that increasing efficiency, once you do that, you get a more than proportional rise in consumption. So there's not just rebound, but you end up consuming more. You never save. And the evidence and the theory are both highly contested, but it's an idea that's still alive now. And you look back in the 19th century, I mean, basically the 1900 to 1915 trends were the continuation of what he was seeing in the 19th century. Well, you see, the intensities are going up, still going up. The turnaround didn't happen until well after Jevons was writing. Maybe he had a point. The other one is the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis, and this one is motivated more by a narrative of economic development. In the early stages, you've got rising intensity because you've got resource-intensive production. You're switching from agriculture to industry. You're trying to build up, raise incomes, and that's more important than preserving the environment. Later, you've got higher labor productivity. Wages are growing. You're shifting from industry to services. Your industry is highly productive now, and people can afford environmental quality. And so you expect this kind of turnaround. And the implication is development creates its own solution. Unfortunately, when you look across countries, the evidence turns out to be rather weak in that you take a model that seems to find evidence for it, you change the specification a bit, and the significance goes away. So this appears not to be a robust finding. Nevertheless, it's an idea that still pops up. And again, you look back at the history in the U.S., you can see where this idea came from. I mean, you look at what happened. It's not crazy to say that that's what's going on. I'm going to talk about a new approach to this problem. And I'm going to focus on the productive economy. I'm also thinking about consumers separately, but I see that as a separate research track. because the consumers are facing different incentives and constraints from the cost of the fuels and energy-intensive goods that they might have. And I'm going to use some recent work that built on an old idea of Sir John Hicks from 1932, this idea of biased technological change. And the basic idea with biased technological change is the pace of growth in factor productivity, whatever you're putting into production, rises with the cost share for that factor. So Hicks put forward this idea in 1932. It was picked up later in a number of different schools of economic thought, neoclassical, what's called Sraffian or neo-Ricardian. These authors, Duménil and Lévy, they're the ones I was building off of. They're actually Marxian authors, but they were writing a paper that was explicitly evolutionary. And then classical is distinct from neoclassical, and then more recently I'm trying to build this into some post-Keynesian models. And Duménil and Lévy's, their evolutionary theory, this is the basic idea. Firms are sitting there looking for innovations that will raise their profits. And they're just searching not entirely randomly. They've got research tracks to follow, but they're not guaranteed of a particular, to find a particular discovery. And so they're looking, and when they implement it, they get to implement their discovery before anybody else does, which means and this was what Duménil and Lévy were looking at. This is what Hicks was looking at. Then you get this viability condition that the profit share multiplied by the corresponding, this hat I'm using for a growth rate, profit share times the corresponding productivity growth rate plus the wage share times its corresponding productivity growth rate has to be greater than 0. And so this is the schema that they put out. These circles suggest a probability distribution, the probability that you would find some particular technology. And the space it's in is in the growth rate of capital and labor productivity. And most of the options are going to give you negative. I mean, they're untenable. And the way that they set theirs up, they wanted to show that a bias emerged from this process of selecting technologies, starting from an unbiased distribution. So it's circularly symmetric. It's also symmetric around the diagonal line. They're not saying this is necessarily how this works, how the technologies work, but they wanted to show that this bias comes up. So there's an unbiased probability of discovering a technology. This viability line comes from the inequality in the previous page. Any viable technology has to be in a positive direction away from that line. So the average is going to be sitting somewhere around there. I was having trouble with this pointer. Let me see if I can. Yeah, around there. It depends on the profit and wage shares. So if those change, it shifts the line, and it shifts the average here. And so what you end up with is biased technological change. The rate of improvement in labor productivity is positive. In this case, in capital productivity, it happens to be negative here and almost 0 here. And so they said, okay, you can, in fact, explain a bias towards labor-saving inventions, which we do, in fact, see, with a broadly trendless capital productivity, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but averaging about 0. So they said, that's great. I've recently worked to extend this model. So here, if you're good with this, you can follow along. If you're not, you can zone out. So you got the cost share. So now it's in a vector form. You've got a cost share with a dot product with the factor productivity growth rate. Those are vectors. I'm taking an arbitrary probability distribution. I don't make any assumptions about its symmetry or anything like that. Multiply it by the growth rate and by the Heaviside function, the step function. So now I'm enforcing this condition, the viability condition, to find the average viable improvement. The derivative of the Heaviside function is the Dirac delta function. And so I can get this matrix of the change in the growth rate, average growth rate of productivity with a change in the cost share. That's my expression. And then I can find some things from that. So this is quite general. It's more general than what Duménil and Lévy were doing. One is that the own response of the productivity growth to its own cost share is always positive. Another one is that as a tendency, a change in productivity growth tends to align with the cost share change, in that the dot product of the change in the cost share with the corresponding change in the productivity growth rate is positive. And that's almost what I want to show that biased technological change will happen. What I want is that the total change in the productivity growth rate will always increase when the associated cost share rises. I've almost got that. I've got the partial derivative, yes, and I've got this tendency. It turns out that there's an edge case that's not very common or interesting and that should disappear. So I'm not going to talk about it much from here, but I just want to say what it is. If you've got two complementary inputs, so you increase one, you always want to increase the other one. And with a cost structure such that you increase the efficiency in one of them and it leads to such a large fall in the cost for the second one that it makes sense to use even more of the first one. This can happen, but it can't go on forever because eventually one of those, their cost share is going to rise too much and then it will be a barrier. So on economic grounds, I understand this exception can exist, but I would expect it to be temporary. So I am going to assume this result, biased technological change, as a tendency while acknowledging that there can be temporary deviations for some pairs of factors. And now I want to apply this to energy. And first I'm just going to start with some accounting identities. I've got the growth in the cost share, and that's equal to the growth in the price less the growth in productivity. That's an accounting identity. Growth in energy use is equal to GDP growth rate less the growth in productivity. Just accounting identities. And then I'm going to add a pretty conventional supply schedule, so pricing scheme for energy. And with this, I'm working at an abstract level. I've got one energy. You can say it's exergy. It's just one energy carrier in order to, make some progress. So I'll say something about using multiple energy carriers in a moment. So the supply schedule, it increases with the energy use or energy extraction relative to capacity. So when that gets up closer to capacity, the price tends to go up. But it can also change exogenously. And when you look at the growth rate, you've got an exogenous change just from a shift in the supply schedule. And then you've got an elasticity that depends on how fast this ratio E over C is changing. And when you combine those, you get this formula right here for the change in the cost share relative to these other variables. And I then combine this with the result for biased technological change. So suppose the cost share has been rising. Suppose that's positive. That's rising, so the growth rate of productivity growth rate is also rising. So that goes up. There's a negative sign there. That tends to depress the growth in the cost share. And so you get this negative feedback that drives you to an equilibrium where the cost share isn't changing. That's the result. Now, I'm going to mention this on the next slide again, but I just want to say you can put multiple energy carriers in multiple sectors, and this turns out that modifies it a little bit so that you can have some deviations from this pattern. Like if you're changing overwhelmingly from industry to services, you can capture that in here too. And so at equilibrium, you set this equal to 0, the growth in the cost share, and you get this formula for the growth in productivity. And I'm going to work with this formula henceforth. So let me just pause for a moment and ask, is anybody just totally lost with the math? Yes. Okay. So that's all right. So here's what's happening, is that there's an induced improvement in energy productivity, and it's induced by energy costs, and those energy costs are driven by GDP growth, but then they're slowed down by growth in capacity to produce the energy resource. So you open a new field and the price drops and there's less pressure to improve the productivity, the energy productivity, because it's not your highest cost anymore. Something else is costing more. That's where you want to put your effort. You can also just have a shift in the cost from some other cause, nothing to do with capacity. Something to do with a tariff, could be some addition to the cost. For example, you've got I mean, some of this gets tied up with capacity, but you've got a storm. It's more costly to do the transport because a lot of things have been diverted, and so shipping suddenly becomes more costly. Lots of things can shift the cost schedule separately, and so this separates those two factors, expanding capacity and everything else. But basically, it's the cost passing into a pressure to improve the productivity. And a key variable here is this epsilon, this elasticity, which says how responsive is the price to a change in demand. And I'll come to that in another slide in a moment. If there's nothing external driving the cost, so just say for a moment there's no external factors, you're just looking at the internal working of the system, then you get this result. And this expression, so you're taking the growth rate of GDP and subtracting a presumably expanding or static capacity, multiplying it by something that's less than 1, this is less than the growth rate of GDP. And that means the productivity growth rate is less than the growth rate of GDP. Comes out of the model, and that means there is no absolute decoupling. For it to be absolute decoupling, you'd have to have this greater than that. But you do have relative decoupling because you've still got a positive change in the, or you can have still a positive change in the in productivity. So productivity is still going up. Your efficiency is improving. But it's not faster than GDP, and so you don't get absolute decoupling. And like I said, introducing multiple energy carriers in economic sectors allows some deviations from this pattern. But this is basically it. This is the essential results, saying from this framework, you do not see decoupling. You see you expect to see what's actually observed. Yes, relative decoupling. No absolute decoupling. So in words, every firm is continually testing and innovating to try to raise their profitability, and some of those innovations save on energy. The innovations then spread. So firms can't hold on to those excess profits. Eventually other people have them, and prices start to change. Also, the aggregate energy demand starts to change, and energy producers change their prices in response to that. And the net result is nearly always a partial rebound, and so that's what I was showing there. As a diagram, so these are the things coming into it. Energy use rises with the economic output. It decreases with productivity. Assuming capacity responds to anticipated growth in use, that'll increase that. Use more, it increases the energy price. More capacity decreases it. A rising price drives an energy higher cost share. Inflation was implicit in that, but it would tend to decrease it. You increase energy productivity, it cuts down on the cost share. And then, this is the biased technological change. It's the only additional thing to this that comes from the biased technological change, but it makes all the difference. Rising energy cost share drives energy productivity growth. So that's the systems diagram for what's happening. And I want to emphasize that what I've been presenting is unconventional economics. So you might be, some of you might be familiar with some economic ideas and you would have expected me to present some things. So I'll just say that here, energy suppliers have a supply schedule, but firms do not have a demand schedule. Instead, they're just looking for these technologies. If they find one that's profitable, they implement it. It just so happens that that results in a biased technological change that then gives them effectively a demand response to price. But it's not your regular demand-supply curves. It's a different kind of dynamic. And so there's not a market-clearing price here. Firms aren't optimizers, and they don't have smooth production functions. I never have to assume that. And if there's a production possibilities frontier, if it exists, firms don't know where it is. They're just looking locally compared to what they've got. Nevertheless, there's still an equilibrium that's characterized by a constant cost share. Not a market clearing price, but a constant cost share. So now I'm going to say a bit more about the resource constraints. That parameter epsilon measures how responsive the price is to a change in demand. If you've got ample resources, then there's almost no response to a change in demand. And in the limit that epsilon goes to 0, you just get that the growth in the productivity is equal to this external factor that's driving prices up and down. If it's not changing, if it's 0, then you just get a constant productivity. The other limit, you're up against the limits to your resources. Every small movement in how much you demand drives the price way up or way down. So in the limit that epsilon goes to infinity, that's the extreme, you get that GDP growth is equal to the growth in capacity plus the growth in productivity. And I would argue that this might be what Jevons was seeing. In fact, this was the case for coal. There was a constraint. It was a fundamental constraint on industrial production. And every time they were able to improve how fast they could draw coal out of the ground, or how affordably they could do it, and how efficiently they could use the coal they had extracted, that increased the rate at which they could increase production. So you do have this positive response. You get a boost to output. I would say the 20th century is characterized by this. There's the change in capital product, in energy productivity. It's doing its own thing. It's responding to prices. But GDP growth is constrained by other things, not by energy. Through most of the 20th century, it was constrained by the rate at which you could accumulate capital. In the 21st century, possibly we're coming back to this, constraints on resources. And James Galbraith has called this the choke chain effect in his book. I highly recommend it. And one thing that comes out of this model is the possibility of engineering a decoupling. So suppose you've got ample resources, so you can always expand capacity to keep up with anticipated demand. And then still you got this equilibrium expression, same expression, and you find that the growth in energy use is equal to GDP growth less this exogenous price change in the price. And if you can engineer a predictably rising price that's rising at a rate equal to GDP growth plus a small amount, then your absolute change in the absolute energy use is negative. So that's the idea, is that you can engineer a decoupling. And what you need is not an energy price, a fixed energy price. You need a steadily rising one that's always rising, but predictably rising. Is this crazy? Well, so it's certainly different from many discussions in that people tend to talk about single prices for energy or for carbon. But in fact, in the EU's emissions trading scheme, what they aimed to do was have a clear and predictable decline of the cap. Okay, decline of the cap, so instead of aiming at the beta, they're aiming at capacity. So they're saying, keep that going down, has the same effect. It tends to push the price up. A clear and predictable decline of the cap over a long period of time is a core design feature of the EU ETS. And the interesting thing is, I mean, the people who came up with this and the people who wrote this book that I'm citing here, some of them are economists. They understand perfectly well all the economics that goes into this, but this was basically a political decision. They did not use the conventional economics. I searched through the book to try to find it. They did use economic analysis. They assessed the potential, how hard it would be for actual industrial sectors, actual industries on the ground to make these changes. What are the actual technologies available? How much do they cost? How fast are the costs changing? And so on. They did an economic analysis. But if you were to try to set the price according to conventional economics, it would give you reassurance but no guidance. In that, what you look for this environmental price, you pull the environmental economics theory off the shelf and it tells you use Pigou's theorem and the Pigovian price should equal marginal social cost. So you have to find the social cost. In this case, the social cost of carbon. And there's a broad expectation that the social cost of carbon is going to rise as you accumulate atmospheric carbon, because every additional bit is going to create more harm and a disproportionate addition of harm. And so you expect that price to rise. But estimates are really controversial. I mean, it doesn't tell you the theory doesn't tell you what price to come to. I mean, people measure social cost of carbon. It varies over a wide range depending on the discount rate that you assume, depending on what costs you include, what's your damage function. And the pace of change is not predictable. Even if you could agree on a scheme, it depends on what other people do as well. And it depends on how much you're paying for adaptation and the effectiveness of your adaptation measures. So what I'm proposing is both reassuring, yes, steadily raise the price, and it offers some guidance. Raise the price slightly higher than GDP growth. I'll just say in an aside, how far do I trust this as a policy suggestion? No. This is a single sector model. I'm just playing around. It's just an intriguing observation. That's all that I think at the moment. But I feel it's worth pursuing. So my conclusions. Firms making local improvements, combine that with competitive markets for energy, and that by itself can explain why we see relative decoupling but not absolute decoupling. Don't have to worry about Jevons Paradox or the AKC or other theories. I think this does it. And it works with and without resource constraints. You can get Jevons Paradox in one limit. You can get other behavior in other limits. And I would say Jevons Paradox was formulated at a time when resources were constraining, and we might be seeing that again. And then I would say, as a tantalizing observation, a predictably rising energy price can, in the model, stimulate decoupling when resources aren't constraining. And as my final comment, I'm just going to say that work is ongoing in many economic traditions, not just neoclassical, although that's mostly what you see. There's a lot going on. They've got journals. You can read it. And I'd say they've all got something to teach us. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Right behind you.
With my limited knowledge of this field, when I think of decoupling, the example I think of is California electricity use from whenever, 1990, or we know, you've seen the graph. How does that relate to what you're saying? Because I think what you're talking about is decisions on the production side, and maybe California was policy on consumption, but I'm sort of half lost, you know what I mean?
No, you're not lost. That's exactly right. And I would say that that on the consumption side, it's a different set of measures you can undertake. I mean, one way that this has been phrased is we engage in exchanges in the economy in order to meet needs. Some of those needs are physically based, and they inevitably involve some consumption of energy. And then some of those are not physically based. They have to do with our feelings of self-esteem, our feelings of our love of variety, whatever it might be. And right now we're meeting a lot of those non-material needs through material means. And it's a question to what extent that's part of how we structure our lives, and is that going to continue or not? And another question that I'm trying to get a handle on is to what extent does that material consumption support the incomes of our fellow citizens? And so shifting away from that, what are the implications for people? And I think the answer is not obvious, so that's why I'm pursuing it through models. But it is a different thing. Yeah.
I think you made a comment about that energy suppliers are not impacted by essentially demand in the marketplace. Rather, it was a supply curve, more importantly. And could you elaborate on that, please?
I certainly will. And I'm sorry I misled you, and I'm really glad that you asked that question, because that's not what I meant to say. In that marketplace, there is, I should separate it. There are two sectors in the economy that I presented. And now I'm blushing because I should have made this distinction in the presentation. There's energy suppliers, and then there's ordinary firms. The ordinary firms are pricing by markup. They are, and there is no market clearing price there. And they're making decisions about how much to consume. Energy is a competitive market where you've got demand responding by supply, and you have a market clearing price in that market. So the energy price is a market clearing price. But you're not facing a demand schedule, because the firm decisions are more complicated than that, and they play out over time. There is this supply-demand dynamic going on, but it has to do, on the demand side, it has to do with technological innovation, implementing it, how that spreads, how firms change their prices and their cost structure. In a full model, it also means how the prices I mean, since they're buying goods from other firms, how those prices percolate through the economy. So basically, I'm saying it's at any moment you've got a market clearing price for energy. Firm prices are not market clearing prices. They're set to recover costs. And it's not helpful to think of the market clearing price in the energy market as the intersection of a demand and supply schedule. You've got a supply schedule and you've got a complicated process that's generating demand. That's what I meant to say.
I'll ask a question. So what are your, I guess, conclusions of your work, something on trying to reach an equilibrium cost share, or that given the state of technology or resource constraints. So I'm trying to think of my own little graphs I show where I think about energy cost share. And for England, or before Jevons times, there was roughly, I guess, a high cost share, a high spending on energy that was, I guess, roughly constant but oscillating for a few hundred years. And then there's the industrial transition. And then perhaps we're theorizing that there's a equilibrium cost share now, roughly, I guess, for the Western world or developed world, at this, sort of below 10% range or 6%. So is your interpretation of that consistent with your theory? Would say, like, we basically had a transition of 150 years from one equilibrium cost share to another, and then now the debate is whether that shifts to something else if we go low carbon, or?
So I was making sketches during your presentation, and what I was seeing was episodes of a constant cost share with these intervening episodes of a suddenly rising cost and then a fall, and then you get another steady cost share. And then in the 19th century, something entirely different happened with a rising cost share, rising intensity of energy use and a falling cost share. So I didn't have time to work it through, but it seemed to me that could be consistent, but in the 19th century only with the multi-sector version of the model, where you can have those trends going in opposite directions. And I would say it was driven by a massive change in the structure of the economy, which is well known. It was the Industrial Revolution, and that was driving energy intensity up. At the same time, exactly what Jevons was saying, the cost of extracting the stuff was falling. Other costs were rising relative to energy costs at the same time. So I'd say look at a modern summary of what Jevons wrote, because he was a bit wordy, but yeah.
I have a question. Could you go back to the slide where you show the system dynamics diagram of the equations that you show? Yeah, this one. Could you explain this in terms of energy resources, either like maybe coal and renewables, and like explain where coal couldn't like benefit about what you're studying, and where you think renewables can actually, can be different than what coal got it wrong or something? I'm making that assumption, but.
And I wouldn't say coal got it wrong. It's just a different resource, a different dynamic. So I'm going to, with this diagram, make a simplistic response to that and say it has to do with this link right here, that if your ability to increase the capacity of producing a flow of energy, of generating a power flow, is constrained, then it breaks this link, which then changes the relationship with these others. And I'll just say there's a number of explanations for secular stagnation. One of them is just that, so this is by a man named Gordon. He says, the technologies that came into play in the Industrial Revolution based on fossil fuels basically were played out by the 1920s. And all we've been doing since then is just refining those. And he says that's why we slowed down in the 1970s. That there's only, you come up with a great innovation, and then you play out all the possibilities, and there's only so much you can do. With renewables, we're just starting. I mean, we've seen costs drop tremendously. As the new renewable technologies come in, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for learning and a lot of opportunity for productivity growth and for innovation and employment, and so I would say it would take a long time for this to be broken in terms of renewables, and I'd say just plan for it. You know, it's at some point you'll hit a limit, so fine, work towards a high-tech economy that delivers a good quality of life, that does not demand that you continually expand the energy base. So I'd say maybe that's one difference between coal and the renewables that we could think about. Yeah.
So to go back to the title of your talk, what I'm wondering if you could touch on is the idea that we would want to decouple energy from GDP growth. What I'm going to suggest is perhaps what we want to decouple are negative consequences of energy generation from GDP growth, emissions of CO2 or NOx, and those things. So is it a goal to a certain extent really to reduce our energy consumption per GDP growth, or is it really the negative impacts of the energy or exergy consumption that we want to decouple?
So you're right. That is the question, what you just asked. And so this comes from some intermediate arguments for me. So what could you do to reduce the harm? You can sequester carbon, except you can't. Land-based sequestration is really quite limited. If you're going to do it underground, that's not well-tested technology, and it's geologically constrained, and it's ultimately finite as well. I mean, there's a lot of capacity there, but it's ultimately finite as well. If you're going to use conventional nuclear, I have my own concerns about that, but I tend to try to set those aside and just say, I understand that's on the table, but for many countries it simply isn't. So if I'm trying to think about how you change, how you can transform, then I tend to take that off the table because it's a political no-go in many countries. Here it could be. Here it could be a possibility. And if sustained fusion came about, you'd be set. We'd be set for a very long time. I mean, indefinitely. But we can't count on it. And in the meantime, we have to act now. And it's actually kind of depressing to go back a few decades. I mean, in '94, people were saying it's going to be a lot cheaper if we try to build towards a low-carbon economy now instead of continuing the way we are and then having to retrofit. They said it again around 2000. They said it again, and then I saw almost the same words in the last IPCC assessment report. It's like, okay, every few years, every decade or so, we say that again and again and again. And now we're up against it. I mean, there was an opportunity in the past, and it is squandered, and so now we have to act fast. And I am having trouble seeing how that fast action can happen without attempting to decouple energy from GDP growth. That's it. That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
So could you get back to that previous chart with the circles? And then how would you overlay, taking Neil's question and taking it further, there you go. How would you overlay the emissions or negative externalities intensity on this? Because, I mean, one vision could be that we simply have a zero emissions grid and drop in biofuels that are carbon neutral. And so that would work. And then in that case, who cares, as long as we had a sufficient supply, who would care how much one would use as long as they were zero negative externality?
Exactly.
Right? So how would you kind of plug that in? Because we are seeing some substantial improvements in the small or negative or zero negative externality technologies, some of which are growing quite quickly.
All right, and this is where so I like Dr. King, I work with biophysical economists from time to time, and they tend to downplay anything on a time scale of less than half a millennium. So, but I work for an institute that works on policy advice. I think what you're just describing can take us through decades. I think we've got decades in which we can continue an expansion. There is a concern that at current technologies, if we were to ramp down fossil production as fast as we need to, we would not have the renewables now be able to replace them. But I like the idea of moving really fast on investments to make that replacement possible, to the extent possible, while keeping an eye on the externalities, including some real concerns in many countries about land appropriation. I mean, all of a sudden, with the biofuels, you do run into some difficulties, especially in developing countries, about who's got the power and what happens to people. But supposing that you're really taking care of those, I think that's the way to go. In that very long time frame, eventually that you're going to hit a capacity constraint on the renewables. And it's a soft constraint. You can keep raising it by making some improvements to technology. I mean, one measure you may have heard is energy return on investment. Energy return on, and it's going down. It always tends to go down for fossil fuels. With renewables, it stays steady or goes up because you can improve the rate at which you're getting useful energy out of that. And so I'd say what you just said is in the immediate term, that's the way to go. Is to try to switch over to renewable resources, but keep in mind in the long run that they are ultimately constrained. And if you're not prepared for that, once you start pressing up against the constraints, you'll degrade the resource. You degrade the resource, you've lost. And so I would just say, keep in mind that what you're doing is making use of ultimately something that will keep giving as long as you treat it well. And that's going to put some constraints on things, leading to some structural change in the economy. I mean, I don't think it's a terrible thing. It just leads to structural change in the economy, which has happened many times in the past.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric. It was a great talk.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.